It's December 1995, the first Christmas season of the PlayStation in the West, and so far we've been through 28 games that released in the launch months of September, then October, and November. During this holiday season, we would see the final 9 PlayStation games of 1995, consisting of some more sports games, more flight combat, and the PlayStation debut of one of the most notorious fighting games of all time. So grab your eggnog and your festive snacks and let's check out the last PlayStation games of 1995. The first game of December launched on the 4th. This was NFL GameDay, developed by Sony's sports division, who would later become known as 989 Studios. This was the first entry in the NFL GameDay series and was a direct competitor to EA's Madden NFL games. In the early life cycle of the PlayStation, and even up to the PlayStation 2, Sony was after an exclusive range of sports titles that they hoped would topple the EA Sports empire that was on the rise. However, the only one of these early franchises that would last till today is their MLB series. NFL GameDay featured 3D arenas, it had real-life teams and players due to Sony acquiring the National Football League license, and the game had a lot of customizable features for its time, being able to choose the arena that you play in and even what weather that your match is going to play in. For an early 3D American football game, this game looked good and plays fine enough for a 1995 release. Releasing on the same day as NFL GameDay is Thunderstrike 2 Firestorm, developed and published by Core Design, the later creators of Tomb Raider. This was a sequel to their previous 1992 Thunderhawk game on the Amiga home computer. It is another flight combat action game, but instead of piloting attack planes, you're controlling an AH-73M helicopter. It comes with a variety of firepower ranging from missiles to chain guns, and you progress through the 8 missions completing certain objectives like destroying specific targets. The game does have a really neat cockpit view that has a lot of detail in it for its time, but the same can't really be said about the rest of the game. This hasn't aged the greatest, and while a lot of its jank can be forgiven due to it being a very early 3D helicopter game, it's still quite rough around the edges with sluggish controls, grainy visuals, very short render distance and occasional frame drops. Regardless, I do give the game credit for being the first helicopter action game on the PlayStation, and can't imagine it could have been easy to get this game to the state it did release in. I'd recommend playing it for those curious how these games started out and if it's on the cheaper side. On the 6th, we saw another space shooter with Taito's Jupiter Strike. This is an on-rails shooter, meaning that the game is always scrolling forwards and you're just moving up and around the screen. You shoot at the enemies that spawn in front of you and battle the boss at the end of the stage. Think of something like Nintendo's Star Fox, but in deep space, and that's Jupiter Strike. Except with this game, there aren't any power-ups to collect, and you can't upgrade your ship between stages like some of the previous rail shooters that we've covered so far. And so it does make Jupiter Strike pretty bare bones. It's still impressive with its 3D graphics, but the gameplay does become slightly repetitive with how shallow and simple it is. Regardless, it's still a challenging game that will test your shooter skills with the boss battles that round out the stages. Jupiter Strike is technically impressive, but going back to it today, it does sink in an overcrowded sea of shooters, and especially sci-fi shooters that were all the rage at the time. Next, on the 8th, the PlayStation saw its first entry of the incredibly popular 2D fighting game series in the West, Mortal Kombat 3. This entry was developed and published by Midway Games and originally launched in arcades before coming to the PlayStation. It saw many mechanics new to the series, such as chain combos where you can input a series of uninterruptible attacks, a run button to keep the action fast paced and get back into the fight quicker, and new animalities that saw your fighter transform into a creature before tearing into your opponent, a brilliant take on the series' iconic fatalities. Mortal Kombat 3 also featured a completely revisioned style to reflect its new narrative angle. No longer are we fighting in the titular fighting tournament, but rather the main villain, Shao Kahn, has invaded Earthrealm with his outworld forces and recently revived Queen Sindel. The stages have more urban settings with dark subways and abandoned streets and highways. These stages were also interactive, a first for the series, as if you uppercut your opponent they can be knocked into a different area of the stage and you continue the fight from there. The more western and modern tropes was also reflected in the new music that saw less Asian motifs that the series was known for and more heavy metal rock. It's also reflected in the new roster of characters that featured a bit of mixed reception upon release. You had some awesome new additions here like the Cyborg Ninjas, Cyrax, Sector and secret character Smoke. You also had new villains like Shiva and Sindel, but then some lacking additions were like the traffic cop Striker, and then there was the lack of fan favourites such as Raiden, Johnny Cage and most importantly Scorpion, who were nowhere to be seen. Arguably the poster character of this series alongside Sub-Zero is Scorpion, and so him being absent was a bit of a negative. And the discourse from this would be so harsh with these changes that Midway Games would be quick to release an update in arcades titled Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3 that would add back these cut characters like Scorpion and also add some more stages and music that felt more in line with the Mortal Kombat series. And this version would release so close around when Mortal Kombat 3 hit the PlayStation that it made it pretty redundant quite quickly. Mortal Kombat 3 also suffers, like a few of these arcade fighters, from disgustingly cheap AI. No matter which difficulty that you set it to, you're going to have a hard time playing through the arcade mode, and you'll struggle to win without finding a cheat way that ends up sapping the fun out of the battles. Regardless, Mortal Kombat 3 for the PlayStation was impressive for being, more simply, the first time that a Mortal Kombat console port was really close to the original arcade version, not just graphically, but also in the sound effects and music, with you finally being able to replicate the arcade experience more closely but in the comfort of your home. If you have a second player to play with and can skip past the cheap AI and look past some of the character omissions, this is still a great fighting game and a true product of this era, with its digitized fighters, its epic soundtrack, and its truly incredible looking sub-boss Motaro, a six-limbed stop-motion character. While not the best entry in the series, you can still feel the amount of passion that went into Mortal Kombat 3. On the 15th is easily one of the most unique racing games I've ever played. Developed and published by Mindscape, CyberSpeed is similar to Wipeout in that it's a futuristic racer that has you using weapons to hit your opponents, has you cruising around tight corners and narrow tracks, and overall has this Blade Runner sci-fi feel. Except with CyberSpeed, you and your opponent's vehicles are suspended in the air, attached to a beam of energy, almost like a tram rail. And so this makes it quite restrictive on where you can really go, and turns become trivial because, well, you can't fly off the edge or crash into corners. If you're going too fast, the most that will happen is you'll swing around like a pendulum. From an aesthetic standpoint, it does well in capturing the same rave dance scene as Wipeout does, but on the other hand it doesn't have quite the complexity of that game, and as such it isn't nearly as memorable. Or it is, but not always for the right reasons. My favourite part about the game, however, is not anything to do with the racing at all. It is in fact these CG cutscenes that play between the races, which are like spoof advertisement videos of fictional in-universe products. It's so fitting of the game's bizarre nature that it did work in giving me a chuckle. I love an old game that doesn't take itself too seriously. I will admit I've never seen a racing game quite like CyberSpeed, and I think I never will again, and there's probably a good reason for that, which is why CyberSpeed is a forgotten PS1 game. Not quite a gem, but it's certainly different, and for me that's commendable enough. Another unconventional racing game on the 15th was ESPN Extreme Games. Developed and published by Sony's American sports division, this was quite an unorthodox racer featuring different extreme sports that were related to ESPN's Summer X Games of 1995. You had extreme sports such as skateboarding, rollerblading, street sledging, and mountain biking. These are all accessible in the game, with the objective being to make it past the finish line first, but there is also a side challenge to make it through these gates that will give you access to upgrades for your player character. You can also hit your opponents to gain an advantage in the race. The 6 courses in the game are based on real life locations, with some American tracks and some European. And the graphics, like many games around this time, featured 3D stages, but with 2D sprites used for the player character, environmental detail and other racers. ESPN Extreme Games is also incredibly difficult, also like a lot of these games around this time, with really aggressive and sometimes cheap AI, and when you lose a race, a reporter for ESPN Sports at the time, Susie Kolber, comes on to deliver some lines of tough encouragement, which is a cool fourth wall break for the game. While it hasn't really aged the greatest compared to other racing games like Ridge Racer and Wipeout, which predate this by several months, ESPN Extreme Games is still a thoroughly enjoyable little experiment, mixing these different forms of transport that you don't very often see, especially rollerblading and street sledging. I don't think I've seen that in another game at all other than these Extreme Games series. And they also have a good amount of challenge that has you coming back for more. It seems I wasn't really alone in this thinking as well, as the game would become one of Sony's earlier successes on the console and prompt them to soon greenlight a sequel. Now, Sony wasn't done just yet, with 2 more first-party exclusives to follow NFL GameDay and ESPN Extreme Sports. Warhawk released also on the 15th. It was developed by Single Track and published by Sony. This was another flight combat game, but instead of simulating a modern plane or helicopter, Warhawk instead went with a fictional VTOL aircraft and has you battling futuristic robots, tanks, and a giant airship. Warhawk is one of the most impressive action games of its time, and you can really tell it got a good budget from Sony's backing of the project. While only featuring 6 levels in total, each one stands out and has some really neat visuals and challenging objectives. Blasting apart a huge pyramid in the centre of the desert, or the aforementioned airship stage, is incredible fun, and the controls, while dated, are still different to the 3D flight games that have come before it. Thanks to your vehicle being a VTOL, you can manoeuvre and strafe around your targets as you fire your missiles, while still having the option to blast forward with your afterburners. In your ship's arsenal is a welcome selection of rockets, guided swarmer missiles, and your machine guns. The lock-on rockets look fantastic, as the flames that follow them to their target leave this fiery orange streak across the sky. The cockpit view is also really detailed, with a second screen viewable at the bottom. Now, I wasn't too interested in the plot here. It is quite thin and played out in these, cheap live-action cutscenes, which was becoming an increasingly popular style around this time. The main villain, Creel, was like a dollar store Davros from Doctor Who. The impressive part here is the gameplay, and it still shines to this day, with many fun levels, advanced manoeuvrability, and some great action. While it does take a dip towards the end with a relentless 5th level that is just BS, the journey getting there is worth it for the most part. On the 19th, we had the second sports game from Sony, this being NHL FaceOff, simulating the popular sport of ice hockey. Much like their NFL GameDay, this one also features 3D arenas and real licensed teams and players. But there isn't much single player content here. If you like ice hockey, it's interesting to see the roots of the video game genre, but otherwise there really isn't much here to grab any new players. It's NHL and it's a good enough simulator for its time. The last PlayStation game of 1995 was Hi-Octane, developed by Bullfrog Productions and published by EA. This was a futuristic racing game, again much in the same vein as Wipeout. You've got a selection of hovercraft, each equipped with weapons that you use to take down your rivals with whilst racing at high speeds. One unique feature with Hi-Octane though is that your fuel and your ammunition is on a limited supply. As you're racing, your vehicle will slowly deplete of fuel and you'll need to replenish this at pit stops that are dotted along the tracks. Knowing when to slow down to refuel without running out completely or falling behind the other racers introduces a bit of risk and management to the otherwise familiar racing. There are also some extra modes to this game that you don't see very often, like a hot seat mode that switches which vehicle you're controlling every few seconds. It doesn't always work the best. These are just kind of like modes that you knew that you were just throwing stuff at a board and seeing what stuck. But like many games that we've covered around this time, it was experimenting with a lot of new ideas, which is commendable. Now Hi-Octane doesn't have the best render distance and it has really blocky graphics, but it can be forgiven for trying to make a full 3D racer early into the PlayStation's life cycle, and it's still a very fun experimental project. While I wouldn't recommend it over Wipeout, it is still worth a look if you find it on the cheaper side. And that completes the PlayStation's first year of 1995. My game of the month for December is a close one. It could have been Mortal Kombat 3 had the AI not been so ridiculous, and it could have been Warhawk if it weren't for that 5th stage. So it has to be ESPN Extreme Games, and that's because, like a lot of PlayStation games in 95, it was a commendable experiment, trying something that you still don't really see even all these years later, mixing all these different sports into an action arcade racing game. These first 4 months really had a lot of great little experiments, testing out early 3D technology, live action cutscenes, flight combat mechanics, new sound design, rock and techno music, even licensed tracks from notable artists appear in some of these games. In the first year, the PlayStation was already going leaps and bounds beyond what had come before, transforming the industry into something bigger. But there was something missing from 95 that would come in PlayStation's second year that we will be covering next. It wouldn't be until 1996 when we truly started to see the seeds start to grow for some of these bigger IPs in PlayStation's history. Thanks all for watching this episode. I really hope you have a great Christmas if you're celebrating, and I can't wait to see you back here in the new year when we start to cover the PlayStation games of 1996. Take care and have a great new year.